Long before roads cut through the jungles of the Philippines, before electricity replaced oil lamps, and before churches stood where forests once breathed, people already knew something shared the night with them. They did not speak its name loudly. They did not joke about it, because to speak of it carelessly was believed to invite its attention. In the provinces, when dusk arrived and the sky turned the color of bruised fruit, doors were shut early, windows were sealed with wood and cloth. Mothers gathered their children close, not out of discipline, but out of instinct. Dogs were tied, chickens were pulled inside, fires were kept low. Not because of wild animals, but because somewhere nearby, something that looked human might already be listening. They called it the Aswang, not as a single creature, not as a fairy tale monster, but as a word heavy with meaning, a warning more than a description, a name used for people who crossed a boundary no one was meant to cross, the boundary between being human and becoming something else. In the old belief systems of the islands, everything possessed spirit. Trees had breath, rivers had memory, mountains watched, and humans were not above these forces, they were surrounded by them. Some spirits protected, others punished, and some fed. The Aswang was believed to begin as an ordinary person, a neighbor, a healer, a midwife, someone you greeted in daylight, someone who smiled back. But at some point, something changed. Folklore says it began with hunger, not the hunger of the stomach, but a craving that sleep could not silence, a desire for blood, for organs, for life itself. Some stories say the first act was accidental, others say it was chosen, but once the first feeding happened, there was no return. The body learned the taste, and the spirit followed. People believed that an Aswang could walk among them for years without being known, that it learned how to control its breathing, how to blink like a human, how to keep its eyes from reflecting firelight at night. It laughed at the right moments, it attended gatherings, it prayed, but there were signs. Dogs would growl when it passed, cats would hiss at empty air, infants would cry without reason, and sometimes, during conversations, the Aswang would stare just a moment too long, not at the face, but at the neck, at the chest, at the soft places where blood moved closest to the skin. Villagers believed that an Aswang's true form was not fixed. It could stretch, thin, contort, joints bending where they shouldn't, limbs lengthening silently, feet sometimes turning backward, a detail repeated across many regions as if the land itself remembered it. At night, when the moon rose high enough to bleach color from the world, the Aswang hunted. Not with speed, but with patience. It listened first. It followed sound, coughing, crying, breathing. It memorized routines. It knew which houses slept early, which families had pregnant women, which windows were never locked. And then there was the sound. A sound so subtle many ignored it at first. A soft, rhythmic clicking. Tick, tick, tick. Old people said the sound meant the Aswang was far away, that when the sound became faint, it was already close, and when there was no sound at all, it was above you. Among all forms the Aswang could take, none terrified the villages more than the Manananggal. By day, she was indistinguishable from anyone else, often described as beautiful, quiet, polite, sometimes even kind. She lived alone more often than not, widows, healers, women who refused remarriage. Spanish missionaries later took note of this and turned suspicion into accusation, but the belief existed long before them. By night, the Manananggal prepared. Stories say she retreated to isolated places, banana groves, abandoned huts, deep forest clearings. There, she rubbed her body with a dark, oily substance. Its ingredients were never agreed upon. Some said it was made from herbs, others said it was brewed from human remains. What mattered was what came next. Her body split. Not violently, not with blood, but cleanly at the waist. The lower half remained standing, motionless, as if waiting. From the upper half, wings tore free, not feathered wings, but thin, leathery things that caught the air without sound. And then she rose. Villagers swore the Manananggal did not cast a shadow when she flew, that the wind did not move when she passed, only that clicking sound, sometimes mistaken for insects. She targeted the vulnerable. Pregnant women were her preference. Folklore says she extended a thin, hollow tongue, long, wet, and flexible, slipping it through cracks in roofs, through bamboo slats, through the smallest openings. With it, she fed on blood, on unborn children, on organs still warm with life. In the morning, women would wake weak, dizzy, bleeding internally without wounds. Some miscarried. Others died days later, never knowing why. And sometimes entire households would be found silent, no signs of struggle, no broken doors, just bodies drained of something essential. People learned how to protect themselves. Garlic hung from windows, salt was scattered beneath beds, ash was smeared on door frames, sharp objects were placed pointing outward, believed to disrupt the creature's form. Not because these were weapons, but because belief itself was considered powerful. But the Manananggal was not invincible. Her greatest weakness was what she left behind, the lower half of her body. If villagers found it before dawn, they did not destroy it with fire. They did something worse. They packed it with salt, with ash, with crushed garlic, with vinegar, anything that burned, anything that contaminated. When sunrise came, the upper half could not rejoin, and without becoming whole again, she died. Stories say her scream could be heard miles away. Long after Spanish colonization, the fear did not disappear. In fact, it intensified. Priests wrote of villages paralyzed by panic, of accusations turning into executions, of women burned not because proof existed, but because fear demanded sacrifice. During World War II, reports resurfaced. American soldiers stationed in rural areas recorded local warnings. Patrols refused to move at night. Entire units avoided certain villages after sunset. Some soldiers claimed to hear wings. Others claimed livestock was found drained of blood. Officials dismissed it as hysteria, but the stories continued. Even today, in remote provinces, people still avoid walking alone at night, still lock doors before sunset, still whisper warnings to children who laugh at the dark. Because folklore does not survive centuries unless it feeds on something real. Whether the Aswang is a creature, a psychological shadow, or a reflection of humanity's hunger, the fear remains the same. That the person sitting beside you by day may not be entirely human by night.
The elders used to say that fear did not begin with the creature itself. It began with the doubt. Because once you accepted that something like the Aswang could exist, you were forced to accept something far more disturbing, that evil did not always arrive with claws and fangs. Sometimes it arrived smiling. Sometimes it borrowed a familiar face. Sometimes it shared your food, listened to your stories, and slept only a few houses away. That was what made nights unbearable. In the provinces, darkness was never silent. Insects cried, leaves shifted, bamboo groaned as it cooled. But people learned the difference between normal sounds and the wrong ones. The wrong sounds had intention. A single footstep where no one should be walking. Breathing where no body could be seen. That soft clicking again, closer now, no longer rhythmic, but searching. Some families swore they could smell it before they ever saw signs of it. A metallic scent, like old blood, like rust left in rain. It clung to the air long after the presence was gone. Dogs would refuse to move. Chickens would go quiet, not even rustling. Silence, the elders said, was the loudest warning. And then there were the eyes. Not glowing like in stories meant to frighten children, but reflecting, catching light wrong, a flicker when oil lamps were raised, a shimmer where none should be. People said if you looked long enough, the eyes betrayed everything. That was why you never stared, because if an Aswang knew you were watching, it remembered you. Some believed the Aswang could mark people, not physically, but spiritually. That once noticed, you were no longer just prey, you were familiar, and familiarity bred patience. Attacks did not always come quickly. Sometimes weeks passed, sometimes months. Livestock would be found dead first, goats drained, dogs missing, chickens slaughtered but untouched, as if discarded. These were not warnings, they were preparation. When humans were targeted, it was never random. The sick, the elderly, the pregnant, the isolated, and always at night. People learned not to answer voices after sunset, even voices they recognized, especially voices they recognized. Mothers learned to ignore crying outside their doors. Fathers learned to sleep lightly, weapons within reach. Children learned to stay absolutely still when told. Because the Aswang could imitate. It could sound like a child lost in the dark, like a husband calling from outside, like a neighbor asking for help, and once the door opened, there were stories of survivors, few but enough to keep the fear alive. Some spoke of weight pressing down on their chests, of paralysis, of cold fingers probing ribs and throats, of breath stolen not violently, but slowly, like something savoring the act. One woman from the Visayas told of waking to find a tongue sliding across her skin, not rough, but slick and warm, tasting, measuring. She survived only because the rooster crowed early, breaking the night. She said she heard wings retreating, angry and fast. By morning, she could not stand. Her child did not survive. Villagers believed the Aswang hated dawn, that sunlight did not burn it, but weakened it, forced it back into whatever shape it used to hide among humans. That was why mornings were dangerous too, because the creature returned exhausted, desperate, careless. Some said this was the only time you could see its true reflection, warped, thin, eyes too deep for the face. Spanish priests wrote about these fears with fascination and disgust.
They dismissed the rituals, mocked the protections, and replaced them with prayer and punishment. They declared the Aswang a demon, and those accused of being one were treated accordingly. Women were beaten, healers were executed, entire bloodlines disappeared, and yet the belief never died. Because even after religion spread, even after cities grew, even after science tried to explain miscarriages, disease, and sleep paralysis, people still locked their doors. People still whispered warnings. Because folklore adapts. In some regions, the Aswang was said to become a dog at night, in others a pig, in others a bird with eyes too human. In some stories it walked on all fours, its spine bending backward, head hanging upside down, a detail repeated too often to ignore. One explanation said the Aswang's soul detached partially from its body, allowing it to bend reality around itself. Another said it was possessed by something ancient, something that existed before humans learned to name fear. There were also stories of inheritance, that the condition passed through bloodlines, that mothers passed it to daughters, that some families carried the hunger quietly, controlling it until they could not. That was why accusations were so dangerous. Once a name was spoken, it spread, fear multiplied, logic disappeared. Sometimes the accused were innocent, sometimes they were not, and sometimes the village was right, but too late. During the American occupation, reports surfaced of rural guards refusing patrols at night, of entire roads avoided after sunset, of warnings issued quietly, never written down. Outsiders laughed until livestock disappeared, until someone went missing. Official records labeled it superstition, but superstition does not leave physical remains, and yet bodies were found. Drained, opened without violence, internal organs damaged without external wounds. Doctors blamed animals, infection, misdiagnosis. Villagers knew better, because animals left marks. The Aswang did not. What terrified people most was not the attacks themselves, it was the waiting, the knowledge that something could already be inside the community, eating meals, sharing laughter, standing beside you during daylight hours, perfectly ordinary, and then night would come, and the same hands that greeted you would tear something from you that could never be returned. Even today, in remote areas, people claim sightings, shapes moving against the moon, wings folding into human silhouettes, sounds overhead where no birds fly. Police dismiss it, media jokes about it, but belief does not require permission. It survives in habits, in warnings, in instincts. Parents still tell children not to stay out late, not to trust voices in the dark, not to mock what they don't understand, because the oldest lesson remains unchanged. If the Aswang were only a story, it would not still be feared, and the night would feel less crowded.
There are places in the Philippines where the night still feels unfinished, where the dark does not settle, but waits. In those places, people do not rely on clocks to tell time. They listen instead to the insects, to the wind, to the subtle changes in sound that signal when it is no longer safe to be outside. Because long before electricity and concrete, humans survived by recognizing when the world around them had shifted into something hostile.
The Aswang was part of that understanding. It was not treated as an anomaly, but as a constant, like storms, sickness, or death, something that could be delayed, avoided, or outsmarted, but never erased entirely. Some elders claimed that Aswang did not hunt every night, that feeding weakened them, that after a kill they needed time to recover, to blend back into human life, to let suspicion cool. During those days they were said to appear unusually tired, pale, irritable, avoiding eye contact, refusing food. Others said the hunger never fully left, that it scratched at the inside of the chest, tightening the ribs, whispering when sleep came. That even during the day, the Aswang could smell blood beneath skin, could hear heartbeats too clearly, that self-control was not a virtue, but a necessity. This was why some folklore speaks of Aswang who isolated themselves, who moved away from villages, who lived near forests, mangroves, or mountains, not out of kindness, but survival. Distance reduced temptation, distance reduced witnesses. But isolation bred other problems, loneliness. And loneliness, the stories say, weakened restraint. There were accounts of hunters encountering figures deep in the jungle, thin, crouched shapes that froze when noticed, faces that looked human until they smiled, mouths that opened too wide, voices that spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing words they rarely used. Some hunters never returned. Others came back changed, quiet, detached, unable to sleep indoors again. They never described what they saw in full, only fragments, only impressions, as if language itself failed them. During the late 20th century, belief in the Aswang did not fade, it adapted. Radios spread stories faster, newspapers sensationalized sightings, television mocked what it didn't understand. But in rural areas, the old rules remained. Windows stayed covered at night. Pregnant women avoided being alone. People paid attention to who arrived suddenly and who left just as quietly. There were modern reports, too. In the 1990s, several provinces experienced waves of panic after livestock deaths and unexplained illnesses. Rumors spread of flying figures, of women seen entering forests at dusk and returning before dawn, of shapes dropping from rooftops when lights were turned on. Authorities dismissed it as mass hysteria. But hysteria does not explain claw marks too high to reach. It does not explain footprints that end abruptly. It does not explain the smell, that same metallic scent lingering where nothing should be. One of the most unsettling aspects of Aswang belief is that it does not end with death. Some traditions say that killing an Aswang does not destroy the hunger, that it lingers, that it seeks another host, that families associated with one are watched closely for generations, not out of cruelty, but caution. This is why suspicion follows bloodlines, why some surnames carry unspoken weight, why some families are avoided without explanation, why some children grow up hearing warnings whispered, never spoken aloud. Because belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes reality. Anthropologists have argued that the Aswang represents fear of betrayal, of neighbors turning against each other, of hidden violence within communities. Psychologists speak of sleep paralysis, disease, and trauma. Sociologists speak of scapegoating and control. All of them may be correct. And still, None of that explains why the stories are so consistent, why descriptions match across islands separated by water and time, why the same weaknesses appear again and again, why the same sounds, the same habits, the same warnings survive centuries. Folklore usually changes. The Aswang does not. It waits. It evolves just enough to remain relevant, just enough to remain feared. And perhaps that is the most disturbing part. Not whether the Aswang exists as flesh and blood, but whether the conditions that create it ever truly disappeared. Because as long as there are places where people are isolated, as long as hunger exists, as long as fear spreads faster than understanding, the idea of the Aswang will never die. And in the dark, when the world feels thin, when sleep comes lightly, when the night air carries unfamiliar sounds, that idea feels uncomfortably close, as if something old is still moving between houses, still listening, still waiting for someone to make a mistake, still patient, still hungry.
Some elders believed the Aswang did not fear people. It feared being known. That was why secrecy mattered more than strength, why it blended into routine, why it learned human behavior so carefully. To be seen was not dangerous. To be understood was. In many villages, there were unspoken rules about observation. You noticed, but you did not confront. You suspected, but you did not accuse lightly. Because the moment a name was spoken aloud, the balance broke. And once broken, it could never be restored. There are stories of villages that accused the wrong person. Afterward, the attacks worsened, as if something had been offended. People began to understand that fear itself had consequences, that panic fed the night just as surely as blood did. So they learned restraint, silence, caution. Survival depended not only on protection, but on calm. This is why the Aswang was never hunted openly. It was endured, and that endurance shaped generations. Children grew up watching adults lock doors before sunset without explanation. They learned to sense when a conversation stopped too abruptly, when laughter felt forced, when someone arrived in the village without a clear reason to be there. Strangers were not automatically distrusted, but they were observed. Because the Aswang, folklore says, did not like being watched. There were also those believed to resist it. People said certain individuals were naturally protected, those born with a call, those who survived near-death illnesses, those who possessed a strong spirit, not through faith alone, but through will. The Aswang avoided them, not because it could not harm them, but because they were difficult, alert, aware. Awareness was dangerous. In some accounts, the Aswang reacted violently when recognized, not attacked, but identified, when someone looked at it and knew. In those moments, it fled, or it retaliated with cruelty meant to silence witnesses permanently. This reinforced the belief that survival required subtlety. You never let the Aswang know you knew. One recurring detail appears across many regions: mirrors. Some said the Aswang avoided reflections. Others claimed mirrors revealed distortions, elongated limbs, missing lower halves, eyes too large. But people rarely tested this belief. To confront something that might reveal itself was considered reckless. Instead, mirrors were covered at night, not to trap spirits, but to avoid seeing something you could not unsee. There were nights when entire villages stayed awake, sitting in silence, lamps burning low, waiting for dawn.
No one spoke of why. They didn't need to. Mourning always came with relief, and sometimes with proof. Footprints that led nowhere, bloodless remains, roofs disturbed without damage, people who did not wake up. Those mornings were heavy, quiet, ritualistic. The dead were buried quickly, without spectacle, without questions. Grief was private, survival was communal. Over time, stories accumulated, not as myths, but as warnings. That was the difference. The Aswang was not entertainment. It was not meant to be thrilling. It was a framework for understanding danger when explanations failed, a way to speak about violence without naming perpetrators, a way to explain loss when accountability was impossible. But folklore does not remain static. In cities, the Aswang became a joke, a costume, a horror trope, something to be laughed at because distance makes mockery easy, because concrete dulls instinct, because lights erase shadows. Yet even in cities, the old habits persist. People lock doors at night even when crime is low. Parents warn children not to trust strangers instinctively. People feel unease without knowing why. That unease is inherited, and inheritance does not require belief. It only requires memory. In recent years, anthropologists collecting oral histories noticed something unsettling. Younger generations, even those who claimed not to believe, repeated details accurately. Sounds, smells, behaviors, weaknesses, as if the stories had embedded themselves somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Cultural memory does that. It survives forgetting. And perhaps that is why the Aswang remains. Not because it walks the night as flesh and bone, though some still swear it does, but because it represents a truth humans struggle to face. That danger does not always come from outside the community. That predators can wear familiar faces, that hunger can hide behind politeness, that darkness does not announce itself. It waits. And when night falls in places far from streetlights, where insects still cry and the air still carries scent, people listen. They listen not for monsters, but for the absence of normal sound, because that silence has always meant the same thing. Something is close. Something is watching. And something ancient, patient, and deeply familiar is still moving through the night, not as legend, not as superstition, but as a shadow cast by human fear itself. And as long as fear exists, the Aswang will never truly leave. Somewhere along the way, people began to wonder whether the Aswang ever truly left the places it haunted, or whether it simply learned how to disappear better. Modern life did not erase the old landscapes, it only built over them. Roads cut through forests where rituals were once performed. Houses rose where warnings were once spoken. Concrete replaced soil, but the ground beneath still remembered. There are stories from construction workers who refused night shifts after seeing figures standing at the edge of floodlights, unmoving, watching. Stories of security guards who heard wings where no birds flew, felt air shift without wind, sensed presence without sound. They quit quietly, never filed reports, never explained, because explanation invites ridicule, and ridicule does not protect you. In some areas, people say the Aswang no longer hunts openly, that it no longer flies freely across moonlit skies, that visibility became dangerous once cameras appeared, once lights multiplied, once eyes were everywhere. So it adapted. It stayed indoors. It blended deeper. The hunger, folklore insists, never vanished. It only changed its rhythm, feeding less often, choosing victims who would not be questioned, those whose deaths could be explained away, those already overlooked. Isolation remains its ally. There are accounts from caregivers who swear patients deteriorated overnight for no medical reason, from nurses who felt watched during graveyard shifts, from families who noticed unexplained weakness, recurring nightmares, sudden personality changes in loved ones, not dramatic enough to raise alarms, but consistent enough to unsettle. In older belief, prolonged exposure to an aswang did not always result in death. Sometimes it resulted in draining, loss of vitality, loss of appetite, loss of warmth, as if something was being taken slowly, deliberately, leaving the body intact but hollow. Those affected were said to become withdrawn, quiet, less present, as if a part of them had already been claimed. And this raises a question the folklore never answers directly. Does the aswang only feed on flesh, or does it feed on something less visible? Spirit, vitality, awareness. Some traditions describe the aswang as drawn to strong life energy, joy, fertility, health, that it preferred victims who were vibrant because the contrast was sharper, the taking more satisfying. If that is true, then its presence would not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it would feel like exhaustion, like heaviness, like a slow dimming, which is far harder to prove. This ambiguity is what allowed belief to survive modern scrutiny, because it does not require spectacle. It exists comfortably in uncertainty, in experiences that cannot be measured, in moments dismissed as coincidence, and coincidence is fertile ground for fear. Elders still tell stories of warning dreams, of seeing relatives appear silent and expressionless, only to learn something terrible happened before dawn, of animals refusing to enter certain spaces, of infants staring at corners of rooms with unusual focus. These details are never dramatic when told plainly. That is why they are believed. Fear rooted in exaggeration fades quickly. Fear rooted in pattern does not. One pattern appears again and again. The aswang does not rush. It waits. It observes communities over time, learns habits, identifies vulnerabilities, chooses moments when resistance is lowest, when attention is elsewhere, when explanations will be accepted without question. In this way, the aswang resembles something very human, a predator that survives by understanding its environment, which leads to the most unsettling interpretation of all, that the aswang is not an external force imposed on humanity, but a reflection of what humanity already contains, the capacity to consume, to hide intention, to rationalize harm, to survive at the expense of others. Folklore gives these traits a shape, a sound, a set of rules, because rules create the illusion of control, because naming fear makes it feel manageable, but the fear itself remains. And at night, when lights are low, when the mind is quiet, when old instincts resurface, that fear does not feel symbolic. It feels present. It feels close. It feels like something standing just outside the range of sight, waiting for you to notice the silence, waiting to see if you will listen, waiting to see if you will understand too much. Because once you do, once you truly recognize what the aswang represents, sleep does not come easily, and the night never feels empty again.
There is an old belief that the aswang does not cross thresholds without invitation. Not a spoken invitation, but a quieter one. Routine, predictability, complacency.
When people stop paying attention, when nights feel ordinary again, when fear dulls into habit, that is when the boundaries weaken. Not because the creature grows stronger, but because vigilance fades. In the old days, vigilance was survival. People counted footsteps. They noticed who stayed awake too late. They remembered who returned home just before dawn, breathless, eyes unfocused, clothing damp with dew when there had been no rain. Today, those details are easier to miss. Noise replaces silence. Light replaces shadow. Distraction replaces awareness. But the human body still knows when something is wrong. That instinctive tightening in the chest, that urge to turn around without knowing why, that feeling of being watched that has no source. Folklore says the Aswang senses those moments too, that it pauses when noticed, not frozen, but curious, measuring, deciding whether you are aware enough to be dangerous, whether you will remember, whether you will speak. Because memory is its enemy. This is why stories were passed down orally, carefully, imperfectly, not to preserve accuracy, but to preserve caution. Each retelling changed slightly, adapted to new fears, new environments, new explanations, but the core remained untouched. Do not trust the night completely. Do not assume familiarity equals safety. Do not ignore the silence. Some elders claimed the Aswang could hear thoughts during moments of fear, that panic acted like a signal, that once fear took hold, the hunt had already begun. Others insisted the opposite, that fear repelled it, that confidence confused it, that calm disrupted its rhythm. No one ever agreed. And that uncertainty mattered, because certainty breeds recklessness. There are accounts of people who tried to prove the Aswang did not exist, who stayed out deliberately late, who mocked the warnings, who dared the dark to respond. Some vanished. Others returned shaken, unable to explain what they had encountered, their confidence gone, their laughter quieter, their nights restless. They never spoke details, only that they were wrong. In folklore, the Aswang is rarely defeated directly. There is no dramatic victory, no heroic confrontation. Survival is passive, quiet, often invisible. The creature leaves not because it is driven away, but because conditions shift, because attention returns, because patterns break. This too feels uncomfortably realistic. Most dangers in the world are not ended, they are avoided, and avoidance requires awareness. As years pass, belief softens. Children grow up hearing stories as entertainment instead of instruction. The line between warning and myth blurs. Fear becomes aesthetic, a genre, something consumed safely through screens and speakers. But in places far from cities, where nights are still long, where electricity flickers, where roads end abruptly, the old tone remains. Stories are not told for fun. They are told to prepare. Because there are still nights when dogs howl without direction, when birds scatter from nothing, when something heavy moves across rooftops without leaving marks, when pregnant women dream of weight pressing down on their chests and wake gasping for breath. Doctors explain, scientists analyze, skeptics dismiss, and still people listen to the night, because listening costs nothing. Ignoring it might cost everything. The Aswang does not need belief to exist in these stories. It only needs behavior. It lives in choices: who walks alone, who locks doors, who answers voices after dark. It survives in caution passed quietly from one generation to the next. And perhaps that is why it never fades, because even if the creature itself were gone, even if it never existed as flesh and bone, the fear it represents remains useful. A reminder that not all threats announce themselves, that not all predators look dangerous, that safety is fragile. And so, when the night deepens and familiar sounds fall away, people still pause. They still listen. They still feel that ancient tension settle into their bodies. Not panic, not terror, but alertness. Because somewhere in the collective memory of humanity, something remembers a time when darkness was not empty. And that memory refuses to die. It watches, it waits, and it whispers, softly, endlessly, that the night has never belonged to us alone.
There is a final belief, rarely spoken aloud, even among those who still remember the old stories, that the Aswang does not always come from outside, that sometimes it begins within. In the quiet hours before sleep, when thoughts slow and the mind drifts toward places it avoids during the day, people feel it, a flicker of something uncomfortable, an awareness of how thin the line is between restraint and impulse, between care and hunger, between being seen as human and being something else. Folklore gave that discomfort a shape, because shapes can be feared, and feared things can be resisted. Without that shape, without that story, the fear would have nowhere to go. It would turn inward, it would settle, it would grow unnoticed. So the Aswang became the vessel, the embodiment of what happens when desire is allowed to consume empathy, when secrecy replaces accountability, when isolation feeds something unhealthy until it no longer resembles what it started as. This is why the Aswang is never young in stories. It is always described as old, not in years, but in presence, in patience, in experience, as if it has been learning humans for a very long time. And perhaps it has, because the habits attributed to it are deeply familiar. Watching from a distance, waiting for weakness, choosing moments of vulnerability, leaving little evidence behind. These are not supernatural traits, they are human ones, which is why the stories do not end with triumph, they end with vigilance. Even now, when people claim not to believe, they still hesitate at certain sounds, still feel uneasy in unfamiliar silence, still lock doors before sleeping, still sense when something feels wrong long before logic catches up. The Aswang does not need to be real to be effective. It only needs to be remembered. And memory has a way of shaping behavior long after belief fades. That is the true legacy of the Aswang. Not the wings, not the hunger, not the blood, but the awareness it leaves behind. The reminder that darkness is not just the absence of light, it is the absence of certainty. And in that absence, anything can take shape. So when the night stretches long, when familiar sounds fall away, when the world feels just a little too still, people still listen. They listen not for proof, but for warning, because somewhere, deep beneath reason and routine, something ancient stirs whenever silence becomes too complete. Something that recognizes the old stories not as myths, but as echoes. And whether the Aswang ever truly walked the earth or only walked the human mind, the result is the same. The night is never empty, and it never will be. And even after everything has been said,
Even after the stories seem to reach their natural end, the unease does not leave, because folklore like this was never meant to conclude. In the provinces, there is a saying rarely written down, rarely explained to outsiders, that the Aswang does not follow time the way humans do, that it does not age forward, it accumulates, it gathers years the way moss gathers on stone, quietly, patiently, without urgency. This is why the oldest stories do not feel distant. They feel current. People claim that when someone dies under unexplained circumstances, the Aswang is not immediately blamed. That would be careless. Instead, people wait. They watch patterns. They observe who benefits, who changes, who suddenly avoids daylight, who becomes thinner while others grow weaker. Suspicion is never loud. It moves the way the creature does, slowly, deliberately, never revealing itself all at once. Some elders say the Aswang can sense when it has been truly recognized, not accused, not feared, but understood. That this recognition creates a tension, a pressure, like two predators realizing they see each other clearly for the first time. In those moments, folklore says the Aswang withdraws, not forever, just long enough, because it knows humans forget. Memory fades faster than hunger. Years pass, people move, witnesses die, the land changes, and eventually the conditions return. Isolation, silence, vulnerability. Then the pattern resumes. This cyclical nature is what unsettles anthropologists most. Not the violence, but the timing, the way reports cluster, the way belief resurfaces after periods of quiet, the way fear seems to awaken simultaneously in places with no communication between them, as if something old is being remembered all at once. Some researchers argue this is a coincidence. Others quietly stop investigating, because immersion in these stories changes people. They begin to notice things they once ignored, sounds that feel wrong, silences that feel deliberate, reflections that linger too long. And once that awareness settles in, it does not leave easily. That awareness is the true inheritance, not belief, not superstition, awareness. The Aswang does not need worship, fear, or acknowledgement. It thrives in gaps, gaps in attention, in connection, in understanding. It exists wherever something essential is missing, which is why it is most often associated with the edges of communities, the outskirts, the margins, the forgotten places, because that is where rules weaken and where hunger has room to grow. In the end, the Aswang story does not ask you to believe. It asks you to notice, to recognize how easily harm hides behind normalcy, how quietly danger can observe, how patience often outlasts strength, how familiarity can be the most effective disguise. And when the story finishes, when the voice fades, when the soundscape quiets, when the screen goes dark, the night does not feel the same. It feels occupied. Not by a monster with wings and claws, but by the possibility that something is always paying attention, waiting, learning. And as long as that possibility exists, as long as humans remain capable of hunger without restraint, the Aswang will never truly disappear. It will simply remain where it has always been, just beyond certainty, just beyond sight, and always in the dark.
Even now, after generations of retelling, there are details people hesitate to share. not because they are unbelievable, but because they feel too close. There are accounts of individuals who claimed they could sense an Aswang without seeing it, a pressure behind the eyes, a sudden heaviness in the air, a subtle distortion in how sound traveled. Voices seemed slightly delayed, footsteps did not echo correctly. The night felt thicker, harder to breathe through. Those who experienced this said it was not fear that came first. It was recognition, as if something ancient in the human body remembered a rule the modern mind had forgotten. Do not stay, do not watch, do not challenge. Because the Aswang, according to old belief, does not chase those who flee early. It pursues those who linger, those who hesitate, those who try to understand instead of survive. Curiosity, the stories warn, is dangerous after dark. Some elders believed the Aswang could influence dreams, that it tested people before approaching physically, sending images of flight, separation, falling, being watched from above. Repeated dreams were taken seriously, not as symbols, but as contact. People who shared such dreams were never mocked. They were protected, watched closely, encouraged to sleep surrounded by others, because dreams were thought to weaken boundaries, and the Aswang thrived where boundaries blurred. This belief explains why communal sleeping was common in older villages, why isolation at night was discouraged, why people preferred noise, talking, praying, working over silence. Sound anchored reality, silence invited uncertainty, and uncertainty invited attention. There are stories of entire families sleeping in one room for weeks after a suspected presence, lamps left burning until dawn, doors sealed, windows blocked, no one wandering alone. Eventually, the tension would lift, the night would feel normal again, and life would resume. No celebration, no acknowledgement, just relief. That too is telling, the absence of drama. The Aswang leaves no closure, no confirmation, no resolution, only a sense that something passed through and chose not to stay, which may be the most disturbing aspect of all, because it implies choice, that whatever the Aswang is, it decides, it evaluates, it moves with intention, not randomly, not blindly, intentionally. In the oldest versions of the stories, the Aswang is never described as chaotic. It is methodical, strategic, conservative with its energy. It does not overhunt, it does not draw attention unnecessarily. It behaves like something that wants to continue existing. That alone separates it from fantasy. Fantasy monsters seek spectacle. Predators seek sustainability. And sustainability requires understanding humans, understanding patterns, understanding fear. This is why the Aswang is so often linked to betrayal, because betrayal requires proximity, trust, time, observation. The most frightening monsters are not those that attack openly. They are the ones that wait. As the world grows louder, faster, more connected, it becomes easier to dismiss these ideas, to laugh them off, to reduce them to metaphor. But folklore does not survive because it is entertaining. It survives because it is useful. It teaches caution without demanding proof. It reinforces awareness without requiring authority. It reminds people that not all danger announces itself. And in a world where people still disappear quietly, where harm still hides behind normalcy, where explanations are often incomplete, the Aswang remains relevant. not as a creature that must be believed in, but as a warning that must be remembered. So when night comes, when the world slows, when familiar sounds fade, when something in the dark feels slightly off, the stories return, not loudly, not clearly, but enough. Enough to make you pause, enough to make you listen, enough to remind you that darkness has never been empty, and that whatever once inspired these stories has not been forgotten. It is patient, it is observant, and it has always understood one simple truth. Humans fear the dark not because they cannot see, but because deep down they suspect something else can.
There is a moment, just before sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on certainty. Thoughts slow, boundaries soften, the world narrows to breath and darkness. That moment is when the old stories return most easily, not as words, but as sensations, a sudden awareness of how quiet the room has become, the feeling that the dark is not empty, but occupied, the instinct to turn your head slightly, even when you don't know why. Folklore says the Aswang favors that moment, not because the body is weak, but because the mind is unguarded. In older times, people resisted sleep deliberately. They talked late into the night. They kept lamps burning. They shared stories not to frighten each other, but to anchor themselves in sound and presence. Silence was dangerous. Sleep was vulnerable. Even exhaustion was treated cautiously, because when awareness fades, boundaries thin, and thin boundaries are easy to cross. Some elders claimed the Aswang could sense when someone was alone in spirit, even if not in body. That loneliness was not physical, it was emotional, psychological, a kind of inward withdrawal. Those grieving, those isolated by illness, those who felt unseen. The creature, if it exists at all, is said to be drawn not just to blood, but to absence. Absence of protection, absence of connection, absence of witnesses. This belief reframes the old warnings. They were not just about locking doors, they were about staying connected. Community was defense, awareness was protection, attention was survival. That is why the Aswang never thrives in crowds, why it prefers edges, margins, quiet corners where no one is watching closely enough. And when those conditions vanish, it moves on, not defeated, just patient. People sometimes ask why the Aswang never leaves clear proof, why there are no bodies openly mutilated beyond explanation, why evidence always dissolves into uncertainty. Folklore answers this simply, because proof invites pursuit, and pursuit invites extinction. Whatever inspired the Aswang stories, whether creature, behavior, or collective fear, learned long ago that survival depends on ambiguity, on remaining just believable enough to be feared and just deniable enough to be ignored. This balance has allowed the legend to outlive empires. It survived colonization, it survived religion, it survived science, because it never demanded belief, it only required attention. Even now, when people insist they do not believe, their actions betray something older. They still double-check locks, still feel uneasy in unfamiliar silence, still avoid walking alone in certain places at certain hours. Those instincts did not come from nowhere. They were taught, not by books, by stories told softly at night, by people who had learned caution the hard way. And perhaps that is the final truth hidden inside the Aswang legend, that it is not meant to terrify endlessly, it is meant to remind
to remind people that danger often hides behind routine, that familiarity is not immunity, that darkness deserves respect, not mockery. And when the night stretches long and quiet, when the world feels suspended between sleep and waking, those reminders surface without effort. A pause, a breath held too long, a feeling that something has shifted. At that point, it no longer matters whether the Aswang is real, because the behavior it warns against is. And as long as humans remain capable of ignoring warning signs, as long as hunger, secrecy, and patience exist, as long as people mistake familiarity for safety, the Aswang will continue to walk beside us, not as a monster in the sky, but as a shadow cast by human nature itself, unseen, unconfirmed, unending, and always just close enough to be felt when the night grows still.
There is one last pattern the elders spoke of, usually in lowered voices, usually only when night had already settled. That the Aswang does not reveal itself through chaos. It reveals itself through consistency, through the small things that repeat. A light that turns on at the same hour every night. A figure that walks the same path just before dawn. A house where sickness lingers without spreading. A person who never seems fully rested, no matter how much they sleep. These repetitions were watched carefully, not confronted, not questioned, just remembered. Memory was the oldest weapon. Because when patterns are noticed, the Aswang adapts. It shifts habits, changes routes, finds new edges to exist within. And in doing so, it confirms something was there to begin with. That confirmation is never celebrated. It is endured. Some villages believed that once an Aswang was aware it had been noticed, it would leave for a time. Weeks, months, sometimes years. It would move to another place where attention was weaker, where routines were predictable, where people had grown comfortable again. Comfort, the stories warn, is the most dangerous state. Not fear. Fear sharpens. Comfort dulls. And dullness is invitation. This is why the Aswang legend never encourages bravery. It never asks anyone to confront the dark head-on. It asks for humility, for awareness, for respect of what cannot be fully understood. Heroes do not survive these stories. Observers do. Those who notice and adapt, those who listen and change behavior quietly, those who leave when something feels wrong without needing proof. That lesson remains painfully relevant. Even now, when the world is mapped, lit, and measured, people still vanish, harm still hides behind routine, predators still blend into normal life, and explanations still arrive too late to matter. The Aswang endures because it names that truth without softening it. It says, danger does not always look dangerous. It says, hunger can wear a human face. It says, patience is often deadlier than force. And it says these things without asking to be believed, only remembered. So, when the night feels different, not louder, not darker, just off, the old instincts surface, the ones that don't need logic, the ones that don't wait for evidence. You lock the door, you stay inside, you choose not to investigate that sound. Not because you believe in monsters, but because somewhere deep inside, something older than belief understands that survival has always depended on listening to discomfort.
That understanding is the final echo of the Aswang. Not wings in the sky, not a shadow on the roof, but a quiet pressure urging caution when certainty fails. And as long as humans continue to live between light and darkness, between knowing and not knowing, that echo will remain, unseen, unnamed, but never silent. Because the night, for all its familiarity, has always belonged to more than just us.
And when the last sound fades, when the insects quiet, when the air stills, when even your own breathing feels too loud, there is often a strange realization. Nothing happened. No wings tore through the sky. No shadow crossed the window. No voice called your name. And yet, something changed. That is how these stories were always meant to work. They were never about what you see. They were about what you notice afterward. The way you hesitate before turning off the light. The way you listen more carefully to familiar sounds. The way silence now feels layered instead of empty. The Aswang was never meant to arrive dramatically. It does not announce itself. It does not need to. Its presence is felt in restraint, in the choices people make when no one is watching, in the instincts they obey without understanding why. Long ago, people learned that survival did not come from certainty. It came from caution, from respect for what could not be fully explained, from awareness of patterns before they became disasters, from listening when something felt wrong, even if logic disagreed. That is why the Aswang never truly ends. It lingers not as a creature, but as a reminder that danger often wears familiar faces, that hunger can hide behind routine, and that the night has always held more than we are willing to admit. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, if nothing followed you tonight, if the dark remained quiet, if the silence stayed unbroken, that does not mean nothing was there. It only means you listened well enough. And if stories like this still echo in your mind long after the lights go out, if ancient fears, forgotten legends, and whispered folklore continue to pull at your curiosity, then you already understand why these tales survive. If you want to hear more real folklore legends, darker truths, and ancient stories that refuse to stay buried, follow the night deeper. This is NOXHOUR, where folklore breathes, where legends linger, and where the darkness is never truly silent. Good night.